Welcome to Boring Becomes Fun, where history stops being that thing you used to nap through in class and turns into something weirdly relaxing, a little dark, and, dare I say, dangerously interesting. If you're here to unwind, maybe even drift off to sleep to the gentle hum of ancient chaos, congratulations, you've come to the right place. Because tonight, we're talking about a death that changed the map of Europe, the mysterious, almost cinematic demise of Attila the Hun, the man they called the Scourge of God. Yep, that's right, the Scourge of God. Back in the 5th century, when people didn't have Netflix or nuclear weapons, that was basically the most terrifying job title you could have. Attila was the walking nightmare of Europe, leading an army of horsemen from the steppes, who could shoot arrows while galloping at full speed. These guys didn't believe in brakes or mercy. Under Attila, the Huns became the ultimate apocalypse on horseback. He bullied both halves of the Roman Empire into paying him off just to stay alive, what historians politely call tribute. But let's be honest, it was ancient protection money. The Romans were like, here's another chest of gold. Please don't burn our city this week. And then, one day, the unthinkable happened. The man who had outsmarted emperors, who made cities tremble, died. Not in battle, not by betrayal, but on his wedding night. You heard that right. The great Attila, who outlived wars, plagues, and probably a few assassination attempts, met his end in the bedroom. The next morning, guards found him lying motionless, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. The new bride, a young woman named Ildiko, was gone. Just gone. No signs of struggle, no murder weapon, just a dead warlord, a missing wife, and an empire about to crumble. Historians, being the professional overthinkers they are, split into teams. One team swore he choked on his own blood from a nosebleed after drinking too much. Kind of an embarrassing way to go out for a guy called the Scourge of God. Another team pointed fingers at the new wife, obviously poison. And then there were the holy men who said, no, no, no. This was divine punishment. Because back then, every unsolved mystery had to have a supernatural explanation. But here's the real twist. Attila's death wasn't just weird. It was world-changing. See, when a man like Attila dies, the shockwaves don't stop at his funeral. They ripple across empires. And suddenly, everyone starts asking, who benefits? In Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Emperor Marcian basically popped a bottle of wine that night. No more tribute, no more Hunnic raids. He even cut off all gold payments to the Huns. Like, sorry buddy, no refunds. That's what we call strategic relief. Meanwhile, over in the crumbling Western Roman Empire, things were, well, falling apart in their usual fashion. General Flavius Idius, often called the last true Roman, had this love-hate relationship with Attila. They fought, they made peace. They probably hated each other respectfully. So when Attila dropped dead, Idius must have thought, finally, some good news. Except spoiler, he got stabbed to death by his own emperor a year later. Rome, where HR really needs a seminar on conflict resolution now. The Huns without Attila fell apart faster than a discount IKEA chair. Imagine a massive company where the CEO dies unexpectedly and the entire boardroom starts fighting over the stapler. Tribal leaders turned on each other, alliances shattered, and the great Hunnic Empire vanished within a few short years. But the chaos didn't just destroy, it created, out of that power vacuum that's historians speak for nobody's in charge anymore, new kingdoms started rising. The Goths, the Gepids, the Franks, each carving out their piece of the crumbling world. The Western Roman Empire, already on life support, finally flatlined a few decades later, and from the wreckage, medieval Europe began to form. So yeah, Attila's death was less an ending and more like the season finale that set up the next 1,000 years of history. That the man who terrorized the world became the reason the world reshaped itself. And the ones who feared him most, they're the ones who profited the most from his death. That's the kind of irony history specializes in: brutal, poetic, and slightly ridiculous. So who really won after Attila died? Was it Emperor Marcian who finally got to sleep without nightmares? The Germanic tribes who seized their chance to rise? Or maybe history itself, always finding new ways to turn tragedy into transformation? Either way, one thing's certain. Attila's death wasn't the end of a story. It was the start of a grand conspiracy. A domino effect that changed everything Europe would become. And if you've made it this far, congratulations, you just sat through a history lesson and didn't fall asleep. But don't worry, next time, I'll make sure you do drift off. Because here on Boring Becomes Fun, we make sure every mystery, massacre, and empire collapse comes with just the right amount of dark humor and soothing chaos. So go ahead, hit subscribe, get comfy, and let's keep digging into the parts of history your teachers warned you were too boring. Trust me, they were lying. It's funny how fast the world can change. One night, the Huns are celebrating, feasting, drinking, laughing. Their king, Attila, the Scourge of God, is getting married again. The man who had crushed cities, burned kingdoms, and made emperors tremble, now sits surrounded by music and mead, wearing a smile instead of a sword. And by the next morning, silence. A silence so heavy, even the wind seemed afraid to breathe. When the guards finally entered the tent, They froze. There he was, Attila lying on his back, motionless, his face pale, his nose and mouth streaked with dried blood. The cup of wine he'd been drinking from was still there, tipped over, its contents soaking into the carpet. No wounds, no signs of a fight, just the most feared man in Europe, gone. And the bride, the young woman named Ildiko, the last person to see him alive, had vanished. It was the kind of scene that could launch 1,000 rumors, and it did. Some said Attila had drunk himself to death, others whispered poison, and a few the poetic ones called it divine justice. After all, if anyone deserved an angry god, it was probably Attila. Now, to understand why this one man's death hit like an earthquake, you need to know what kind of storm he was in life. Attila wasn't just another warlord. He was the warlord, a human apocalypse on horseback. His empire stretched from the edge of modern Germany to the plains of Central Asia. He didn't build cities or write laws. His empire was fear itself. When the Romans heard his name, they didn't prepare armies. They prepared payments, gold, silver, silk, whatever it took to keep him away. In fact, the Romans invented a polite word for it, tribute, which really meant, please don't burn our stuff. But now, the man who held half the world hostage was gone, and in that instant, in that eerie morning silence, his entire empire began to unravel. Historians tell us that the Huns buried Attila in secret. They wrapped his body in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, symbols of his power over wealth, war, and the world. Then, according to legend, they killed every person who helped dig the grave so no one would ever find it. A bit dramatic? Sure, but if you were the Scourge of God, a quiet burial probably wasn't your style. And somewhere beneath the soil of the Hungarian plains, the man who had made the world shake disappeared forever. But his death did something even more powerful than his life. It created a vacuum, a dangerous emptiness where empires once trembled. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian got the news, and you can bet that was a good day in the palace. No more paying tribute, no more fear of an invasion. Imagine the relief. Wait, Attila's dead? Seriously? Cancel the gold shipment. And somebody opened the wine. The East had survived Attila's storms, and just like that, they went back to business, richer, safer, smugger. But in the West, things were less peaceful. The Western Roman Empire was already falling apart, broke, corrupt, and led by men who couldn't organize a dinner party, let alone a defense. Their best general, Flavius, had managed to hold Attila off a few years earlier at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, one of the last great Roman victories. Idius was the kind of man who could negotiate peace with a monster and still keep his head. He probably understood Attila better than anyone, and now that Attila was gone, he knew what that meant: chaos. But the emperor, Valentinian III, didn't trust him, because in Roman politics, being competent was often considered a crime. So, in true Roman fashion, Valentinian killed Idius with his own hands. A year later, the emperor himself was assassinated by Idius's former bodyguards. It's like the universe looked at Rome and said, you know what, let's just hit reset. Meanwhile, back in the steppes, the Huns were falling apart. Without Attila's iron fist, the tribal alliances began to crumble. His sons fought each other for the throne. Old allies like the Gepids and Ostrogoths turned on their former masters. Within just a few years, the once mighty Hunnic Empire, the same one that had terrified Europe, was gone. Completely gone. That's the thing about empires built on fear. When the fear disappears, so does everything else. But here's the twist, the kind of irony history seems to love. Attila's death didn't end an age of violence. It started a new one. The vacuum left by the Huns' collapse didn't stay empty for long. Tribes that had been crushed or scattered under Attila began to rise again. The Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, all stepped into the chaos. They carved out kingdoms from the ruins of Rome, and in just a few decades, Europe was unrecognizable. The Western Roman Empire fell, the Middle Ages began, and the world as we know it, divided, tribal, ambitious, took shape. So in a strange, almost poetic way, Attila didn't just destroy the old world. He cleared the stage for the next one. Still, for the Huns, his death was an ending, absolute and final. They believed Attila had been chosen by divine power, a man whose conquests were guided by fate. And when he died, quietly, mysteriously, absurdly, that belief died too. To this day, no one knows what really happened that night. Was it poison? Was it an accident? Maybe a burst blood vessel from too much drinking? Or was it, as some said, divine justice? The universe taking back what it had loaned out for too long. Whatever the truth, the morning after his death changed history forever. If you were a Roman, it felt like the sky had cleared. If you were a Hun, it felt like the ground had fallen away. And if you were a historian, it became one of those perfect, frustrating mysteries that keeps you awake at night, or, depending on your personality, helps you fall asleep. Because in the end, that's the strange beauty of Attila's story. He conquered half the world, and was conquered by a single moment. No battle, no betrayal, just silence. And from that silence came everything that followed the fall of Rome. The rise of medieval kingdoms, and the rebirth of Europe. A wedding night turned into a turning point. A single death became the start of a new world. And history has always moved on. without looking back. So, as we leave that quiet tent somewhere on the steppes, with the fires dying out and the wind whispering through the grass, remember this. Sometimes, the loudest events in history begin with silence. Because the morning Attila died wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the sound of the world, changing its rhythm. When word of Attila's death finally reached Constantinople, it didn't arrive like news of tragedy. It arrived like a punchline. Imagine the moment. Inside the marble halls of the Byzantine palace, the emperor's courtiers whispering, unsure if they'd heard correctly, "The Scourge of God, dead, on his wedding night." Some probably laughed. Others didn't dare to. Not yet. You don't joke about the devil until you're sure he's actually gone. Then, as the reality settled in, something rare happened in the Eastern Roman Empire. People relaxed. For the first time in decades, Emperor Marcian could look out from his balcony at the glittering city of Constantinople and not wonder if an army of horsemen was about to appear on the horizon. To appreciate the collective relief that rolled through the empire, you need to understand what Attila had been to them. He wasn't just an enemy. He was a recurring nightmare. For years, the Eastern Romans, or as we call them now, had been living under what we might call a subscription plan of fear. Every year, Attila would ride up to the Danube River, demand gold, and the emperor would pay. Historians say that by the 440s, the Huns were getting roughly 2,100 pounds of gold a year just to not invade. That's like paying off a warlord with the GDP of a small nation, and still calling it diplomacy. The Romans called it tribute, which sounds polite and civilized. But let's be honest, it was basically protection money. The Eastern Empire was the biggest and richest client in Attila's long-running extortion scheme. Now, Emperor Marcian was a practical man, the kind of ruler who preferred balance sheets to bloodshed. He had come to power in 450 AD after marrying Pulcheria, the sister of the previous emperor Theodosius II. Pulcheria was sharp, devout, and politically savvy. Between the two of them, they were like the empire's ultimate power couple. One ran the empire, the other ran the church, and together they ran circles around their enemies. But there had been one problem they couldn't solve: Attila. For years, Marcian's predecessor had bent over backward to keep the Huns happy, sending gold, sending envoys, sometimes even sending prisoners back, gift-trapped in chains. So when the messenger arrived with the unbelievable news that Attila had died suddenly, quietly, suspiciously, Marcian didn't waste a moment. He called his advisors, looked them in the eyes, and said, probably in the most satisfying tone possible, "Stop the payments." Just like that, the tap was off. No negotiations, no letters of condolence. The empire that had spent decades appeasing the Huns simply stopped. And if that isn't the ancient version of unsubscribed, I don't know what is. Of course, Marcian knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Huns were still dangerous, even without Attila. But he also knew something the rest of the world was only starting to realize. Without their leader, they were nothing but fragments, angry, lost, disorganized fragments. Think of the Huns like a biker gang whose boss just died mid. Sure, they've still got their bikes and their tattoos, but now they're arguing over who's in charge. And half of them are already planning to quit. Marcian understood this instantly. He had spent years watching Rome crumble under its own bad decisions. He wasn't about to make the same mistake. So instead of charging into battle or trying to finish the Huns, he did something far smarter. He waited. That's the thing about Marcian. He wasn't flashy, but he was patient. And patience, in a world obsessed with swords and glory, was the ultimate weapon. While the Western Roman Empire kept tripping over its own ego, Marcian focused on rebuilding his treasury, fortifying his borders, and restoring the Eastern army's confidence. He strengthened the frontier defenses along the Danube and refused to be baited by the chaotic skirmishes erupting north of it. He basically said, let the barbarians kill each other. We'll just be over here, minding our civilization, and it worked. For the first time in years, the Eastern Empire enjoyed something dangerously close to peace. Meanwhile, the Western Romans couldn't catch a break. While Marcian was calmly sipping wine in Constantinople, his counterparts in Ravenna were stabbing each other literally. The West was hemorrhaging money, soldiers, and sanity. It must have felt surreal for the Eastern Romans, watching their cousins implode while their own cities flourished. The East had the wealth, the walls, and the water routes. The West had, well, nostalgia. And in the grand cosmic joke of history, Attila, the man who'd once threatened to destroy Rome, ended up accelerating the downfall of the Western Empire, while indirectly saving the Eastern one. But back to Marcian. Even as he celebrated his good fortune, he knew the world was shifting beneath his feet. The Huns' collapse had created a power vacuum, and nature and politics hate a vacuum. The tribes who'd lived in terror of Attila now started to rise. The Gepids, the Ostrogoths, the Suevi, the Lombards, all the future founders of medieval Europe, began carving their own territories out of the ruins. For Marcian, that was both a blessing and a warning. Yes, the Huns were gone, but in their place was something far more unpredictable: dozens of smaller powers, hungry, ambitious, and eager to prove themselves. If Attila had been a single monster you could fear, this new Europe was a hydra cut off one head, and two more would rise. Now, here's the irony. The Eastern Romans would later call themselves the Byzantine Empire, proud heirs to Roman civilization. But in the 450s, they were still trying to figure out what survival meant. Attila's death had bought them breathing room, a chance to reorganize, to modernize, to become what they would one day be, the longest-lasting empire of the ancient world. They'd outlive the West by 1,000 years, but right then, it was still fragile. One bad move, one bad emperor, and they could have fallen to. So Marcion played it cool. No wars, no revenge, no marching north to claim glory. Just quiet competence, the rarest trait in any government, ancient or modern. He invested in infrastructure, kept taxes reasonable, and restored confidence in the imperial system. While Rome burned, Constantinople sparkled. Of course, not everyone was happy with peace. There were generals who wanted to march against the Hun, leftovers to prove Rome was still Rome. There were priests who declared it death a divine sign and urged the emperor to spread Christianity deeper into the barbarian lands. Marcion smiled politely and ignored them. He knew better than to tempt fate. Because here's a little secret about ancient history: most empires didn't fall because of enemies. They fell because their leaders couldn't stop trying to be heroes. Marcion didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to survive. And that, more than anything, is why the Eastern Roman Empire did. While Europe tore itself apart, Constantinople entered a quiet golden age. Trade routes reopened. Art flourished. The Hagia Sophia, that stunning cathedral built under Justinian a few decades later, would rise from the foundations of this very stability. All because one emperor knew when not to swing the sword. It's almost comedic, in a historical sense. The empire that worshipped conquest was saved by restraint. The Byzantine miracle, as later historians called it, began not with victory, but with patience. And in a way, that patience was the true sigh of relief. You can picture it, can't you? A warm evening in Constantinople. The emperor walking along the palace gardens, the city lights reflecting off the water of the Bosphorus. Somewhere, far away, the remnants of the Huns are fighting among themselves. But here, within these marble walls, peace hums quietly. Maybe Marcion smiled that night. Maybe he looked up at the stars and thought, the Scourge of God is gone. The world might just be sane again. Of course, he was wrong. The world is never sane for long, but for a brief, shining moment, the East exhaled. In the centuries that followed, the Eastern Empire would face Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and finally the Ottomans. They'd lose cities, win them back, and lose them again. But they'd always endure longer than anyone expected. And it all began with that single decision, whispered in a marble hall: stop the payments. That was the sigh of relief heard across the ancient world, the moment the Eastern Roman Empire realized it could stand without fear. And so, in the strange math of history, Attila's death became Marcion's salvation. The destroyer's silence became an emperor's opportunity. One man's fall was another man's peace, and that, more than any victory or battle, is what truly changed the fate of an empire. The night Attila died, the empire didn't crumble all at once. It shuddered. For years, the Huns had been a force of nature, a thunderstorm rolling across Europe. And like any storm, when the thunder stopped, nobody knew what to do with the silence. The morning after his death, word spread like wildfire through the camp. The king, their king, the man who'd promised them endless conquest and gold, was dead. Some wept, some didn't believe it, and others, the ambitious ones, immediately started asking the only question that ever really matters in an empire built on fear. So, who's in charge now? See, Attila wasn't just a ruler. He was the glue, the one thing holding a very messy, very dangerous coalition together. The Hunnic Empire wasn't really an empire in the Roman sense. No marble palaces, no tax offices, no senators arguing about wine prices. It was more like a franchise of chaos, a loose collection of tribes that followed Attila because, well, he won. When Attila rode into battle, every tribe from the Danube to the steppes followed, not because they loved him, but because he made them rich, fear and profit. That's what held the Huns together. And the moment that vanished, everyone started doing math. Attila left behind at least 3 sons, Elah and Ernach, each with the same ambition and none of the charisma. Think of them as the worst kind of family business takeover. Dad was a genius, terrifying but effective. The kids, arguing over the inheritance before the body's even cold. Elach, the eldest, claimed the throne immediately. He called himself King of Kings, which is always a bad sign. People who actually run things don't need to remind you every 5 minutes. Gizik and Ernach weren't having it. Within months, the sons of Attila were at each other's throats. And when a family feud breaks out among warlords, it doesn't just destroy a dinner table, it destroys a continent. Meanwhile, the subject tribes, the Ostrogoths, Gepids, and others were watching closely. For years they'd paid tribute to the Huns, sending warriors and resources in exchange for survival. Now, they saw weakness. The empire that had ruled through fear suddenly looked vulnerable, so they decided to test it. It started small. A few tribes refused to send troops. Others stopped delivering gold. Then came open rebellion. In 54 AD, the Huns tried to crush the revolt. Elach led the charge. determined to prove he could fill his father's boots. The battle took place on the Nadao River, a quiet little stream in modern-day Serbia that nobody had heard of before and nobody forgot afterward. The rebel tribes, led by the king of the Gepids, fought back with everything they had, and to everyone's shock, the Huns lost. Badly. El Lak was killed. Thousands of Hunnic warriors were slaughtered, the survivors scattered across the plains. Just like that, the empire that had terrified Europe for decades ceased to exist. Imagine that. The most feared army in the world, wiped out not by Rome, not by some grand campaign, but by its own former allies. That's the kind of poetic justice even the gods would slow clap for. Historians later called it the end of Hunnic power. But really, it was the end of fear. For the first time in years, the tribes of Europe weren't hiding, they were standing up. The monster under the bed was gone, and they realized they didn't need to be afraid anymore. Of course, the sons of Attila didn't all die that day. Dengizik tried to rebuild, gathering the remnants of the Huns to fight again, but the magic was gone. The army that once united under Attila was now a loose mob, mercenaries without purpose. He raided the eastern Roman border a few times, hoping Marcian's successor would panic and pay up. But this wasn't Theodosius's Rome anymore. The Byzantines were smarter, tougher, and a lot less interested in negotiating with ghosts. Eventually, Dengizik was captured and executed, his head displayed in Constantinople like a macabre trophy. Proof that the nightmare was truly over. His brother Ernuk faded into obscurity, leading a small group of surviving Huns eastward toward the Black Sea. After that, they just disappeared. No epic last stand, no glorious ending. They simply melted into history. It's strange how quickly terror can evaporate. One decade, the Huns are unstoppable, burning cities, extorting emperors. The next, they're gone. That's the fragility of empires built on one man's shadow. When the light goes out, the shadow vanishes. And maybe that's what makes the fall of the Huns so fascinating. Rome had bureaucracy, laws, culture. Even in ruin, it left behind ruins. The Huns left behind only fear. And when the fear faded, nothing remained. But not everything about the Huns vanished. Their downfall reshaped Europe in ways that lasted centuries. The tribes that defeated them became new powers. The Ostrogoths would later carve out a kingdom in Italy. The Franks would rise in Gaul, the ancestors of modern France, and the Gepids, the ones who led the rebellion, ruled the Carpathian Basin for a time before being replaced by another upstart people, the Avars. It's like history, passed around a baton labeled barbarians of destiny. Each group inherited a little of Attila's legacy, his mobility, his warfare, his attitude. Even if they didn't realize it, you could argue that the Huns didn't vanish at all. They just changed names and kept moving west on now. Let's zoom out for a second to the Eastern Romans. This collapse was both a relief and a warning. Relief, because their deadliest enemy was gone. Warning, because chaos never stays contained. As the tribes fought over the Huns' remains, new political borders started forming, fluid, unstable, and violent. The old world, the Roman world, was being replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. The Eastern Empire would survive by building walls, both literal and political. The West, not so lucky. But all of that, the fall of Rome, the birth of medieval Europe, traces back to this single moment. The death of a king on his wedding night, and the slow-motion implosion of everything he'd built. So, what did the fall of the Huns really mean? It meant the end of the last truly nomadic empire in the West. The last time Europe was ruled by horsemen instead of kings. It meant that brute strength, unstoppable though it seemed, was no match for time, ego, and family drama. And it meant that power, real power, only lasts as long as people believe in it. The Huns had ruled through fear. When the fear was gone, so were they. There's a haunting beauty to that, isn't there? Attila's empire rose from nothing, terrified the world, and then evaporated like smoke. No monuments, no libraries, no golden cities, just whispers and old chronicles and maybe a few graves. Hidden beneath the Hungarian plains, it's almost like the Huns never wanted to be remembered, just feared. And fear, as history reminds us, is the most temporary form of power. In the end, the empire without a master became no empire at all. The tribes scattered, the sons died, and the world moved on. But the echo of their thunder, the sound of hooves on the steppe, the hiss of arrows in flight, never really faded. It carried on through the centuries, resurfacing every time a new conqueror rose from the east. The Mongols, the Turks, the countless riders who followed. Each one, in their own way, was a ghost of the Huns. And somewhere in that lineage, maybe Attila would have smiled. Not because he wanted to be remembered, but because the world kept proving his point. Civilization is fragile, and fear always finds a new horse to ride. The empire was gone, but the legend, the myth of the unstoppable rider, the conqueror who needed no walls, no cities, no crown, lived on. Whispered by storytellers, painted by chroniclers, feared by kings. And every time Europe thought it was safe again, somewhere out on the steppes, the wind would start to sound like hooves. History doesn't hit pause when a king dies. It hits fast forward. When Attila fell, the world didn't breathe a sigh of peace. It hiccuped, then started rearranging itself in ways no one could have predicted. Empires don't just vanish quietly, they leave gravity behind in Europe. Suddenly free of the Hunnic pole, began spinning in a whole new direction. Let's start with the obvious, the Romans. The Western Empire had already been staggering like a drunk at last call, and Attila's death was the final shove toward the door. For years, Rome's greatest strength wasn't its army, it was its ability to bribe people not to fight it. The Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, everyone had a price. When Attila died, those payments didn't stop because of generosity. They stopped because there was no one left powerful enough to demand them. And that, ironically, left a lot of people unemployed, angry men with swords, and nowhere to go. So what do angry men with swords do? They start freelancing. Within a few decades, the Western Roman Empire was carved up like a holiday turkey. The Visigoths took Spain. The Franks grabbed Gaul. The Vandals, in what might be history's greatest inside joke, conquered North Africa and became pirates. Rome itself. In 476 AD, less than 25 years after Attila's death, the last emperor was overthrown by a Germanic general named Odoacer. That's right, Rome wasn't destroyed by a barbarian invasion. It was taken over by one of its employees. Meanwhile, in the east, the Byzantines were sitting pretty, sipping wine, and watching the West implode like a bad reality show. Emperor Marcian had already stopped paying off the Huns, saving a fortune, and his successors invested it in something even better than peace, survival. While Western Europe crumbled, the East rebuilt its cities, armies, and economy. The Byzantines became the bankers of the ancient world. If Rome had died of debt, Constantinople learned to live off interest. So yes, Attila's death freed the East, but it doomed the West. That's the first domino. The split became permanent. From then on, there wasn't one Rome, there were two Europes. Now, what about the tribes that filled the void? When Attila's empire fell, everyone who had once lived under his boot suddenly got ideas. The Ostrogoths, who'd been Hunnic vassals, rose under their new leader, Theodoric, and built a kingdom in Italy. The Franks, led by Clovis, united Gaul and became the foundation of modern France. The Anglo-Saxons crossed the sea into Britain, kicking off a thousand-year identity crisis that eventually gave us Shakespeare and sarcasm. Each of these tribes carried a little piece of the Hunnic legacy. The speed, the savagery, the constant motion. Europe went from the marble.com of Roman order to a restless, violent, shape-shifting landscape, a place where power changed hands faster than the weather. And that volatility, that endless reshuffling, became the engine of European history. If Attila had lived, maybe he'd have built something lasting, a steppe kingdom stretching from the Black Sea to the Rhine. But instead, his sudden death created a kind of geopolitical black hole. Pulling everyone in, the Huns fall opened migration routes across the continent. Tribes that had been trapped east of the Danube now poured westward. Borders blurred. Languages collided. You can almost picture a giant game of historical musical chairs, except everyone's armed, and the chairs are on fire. The result wasn't just new kingdoms, it was a new Europe. Here's the funny part. The people of the 5th century didn't know they were rewriting Europe. To them, it was just chaos. Famine, war, refugees, political collapses, the usual Tuesday. But looking back, it's clear that out of that chaos came the DNA of the modern world. The Franks would evolve into the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, the so-called father of Europe. The Goths would bring Roman law into the barbarian world, preserving it for the future. And the Byzantines, isolated but intact, would guard the knowledge of Greece and Rome until the Renaissance came calling 1,000 years later. All of that started because Attila died, and nobody could fill his shoes. Of course, not everyone saw it as progress. To the Romans, it was the apocalypse. To monks and chroniclers, it was divine punishment for sin. And to the Huns surviving warriors, it was betrayal, a world that no longer feared them. But to us, sitting comfortably centuries later, it looks like evolution. Violent, messy, tragic, but evolution nonetheless. The death of the old world made room for the new one. There's another layer to this domino effect, one that's less political, more psychological. Attila's rise had proven that a single, unstoppable force could terrify the entire continent. His death proved that no such force could last forever. That paradox, the dream of power versus its inevitable collapse, haunted Europe for centuries. From Charlemagne to Napoleon, from Hitler to the Soviets, every empire builder since has tried to do what Attila couldn't: unite the continent under one rule. And every single one of them has failed, because Europe, it turns out, likes chaos. It thrives on balance through conflict, 100 moving parts, never still for long. It's as if Attila's fall hardwired the continent with a simple rule: no one man gets to own it all. So, in a darkly poetic way, Attila the Hun became Europe's greatest unintentional architect. By dying, he cleared the board and forced everyone else to play differently. The Romans learned humility, the tribes learned ambition, and the continent learned reinvention. Every border, every language, every war that followed, they all traced their roots back to that one night, that one silent tent, in the corpse of a warlord who'd once made the world tremble. It's tempting to call that fate, but really, it's just history doing what it always does, turning disaster into direction. The Huns wanted conquest. Instead, They gave Europe motion, and centuries later, when medieval knights charged into battle on horseback, when crusaders rode east, when Mongols thundered west, each was, in a way, echoing the ghost of Attila's riders. He didn't build a civilization, he built momentum. So the next time you hear someone call the fall of Rome the Dark Ages, remember this: darkness isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the light changing hands. Attila's death wasn't a full stop. It was a semicolon, the pause before Europe took a deep breath and rewrote itself. The old order collapsed, but from its wreckage, 1,000 new stories began. History has a funny way of keeping its monsters alive. Attila may have vanished from the maps, but not from memory. His death buried an empire and somehow gave birth to a legend that the Romans called him Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God, a title that sounded like both a curse and a compliment. And like any good curse, it didn't die with the man who carried it. After Attila's death, the stories began to twist. The fear that once made men tremble turned into myth. Some claimed he hadn't died from a nosebleed at all, that the gods struck him down for his arrogance. Others whispered that he was only sleeping beneath the earth, waiting to rise again. Don't sound familiar? Every few centuries, Europe invents another sleeping king. Arthur, Barbarossa, Napoleon. Apparently, we never stop hoping some long-dead tyrant will come back and fix the mess we've made. Attila, in a way, became the original template, the ghost of power that refuses to stay buried. For centuries, monks kept writing about him, not as a man, but as a warning. They painted him with fire in his eyes and villages burning behind him, a walking apocalypse to remind people what divine anger looked like. But out on the steppes, the story was different. Nomads remembered him as a hero, fierce, just, untamed. To them, Attila wasn't a curse. He was freedom on horseback. Same man. Two completely different myths. And yet, Attila's real legacy wasn't in those stories. It was in Europe's DNA. He didn't just destroy Rome, he taught Europe how to survive destruction. After him, every conqueror, Frank, Goth, Byzantine, take your pick, learned a simple truth. You can build an empire with violence, but you can't keep it without structure. From his shadow, new nations learned to organize, to balance power, to replace brute force with strategy. In a strange way, they were fixing Attila's mistakes, building what he never could. Over time, his name turned into a mirror, a reflection of our own obsession with power. Whenever someone new rose, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, Napoleon, Hitler, people whispered, that's Attila reborn, not because they were the same, but because Attila had become the blueprint for fear itself. A reminder that absolute power always ends in absolute loneliness. 15 centuries later, his bones are dust, but his shadow, still riding, because every time someone tries to rule the world, every time a new empire rises, Attila's ghost gallops back into the story, smiling. Silent, unstoppable. The Scourge of God is long gone. But Europe never stopped hearing his echo, that faint thunder of hooves in the distance, reminding us that history never really buries its monsters, it just teaches them how to haunt. There's a special kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Not peace, not really, just that strange stillness when the thunder's gone, and you're left wondering what's going to grow in its place. That's what Europe felt when Attila disappeared. For years, his name was the sound of hooves and fire, the heartbeat of fear itself. And then, silence. But that silence wasn't empty. It was changing things. Most people remember Attila as a barbarian, a destroyer, a horseman tearing across the map. But if you look closer, you see something else. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a mirror. Rome looked at him and saw what it was becoming. Greedy, brittle, tired. The tribes saw him and learned how dangerous unity could be when it's built on one man's will. And the rest of the world? It's been chasing his reflection ever since. Attila didn't invent fear. He turned it into an art form. He didn't end civilization. He reminded it how easy it was to break. And when he died, people didn't stop fearing him. They started missing him, because every few generations someone tries to bring him back. They don't call him Attila, of course. They call him Emperor, Kaiser, Führer, Supreme Leader. Different names, same idea. One man, one vision, one unstoppable force. And every time, the same ending. A rise, a reign, a ruin, like clockwork. That's the curse of the Scourge, not that he lived, but that his story keeps repeating, somewhere out on the Hungarian plains. Legend says he was buried in 3 coffins, iron, silver, and gold, and that the men who buried him were killed, so no one could ever find his grave. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's just a story. But it feels right, doesn't it? A man who ruled through terror, buried in silence. A legacy wrapped in myth, sealed forever. The world tried to bury him, and yet, somehow, he never really stayed buried. History moved on. Empires fell, new ones rose. But sometimes, when the wind cuts across the steppe just right, you can still hear it, that faint rumble of hooves. And if you listen close enough in the chaos of politics, in the march of armies, in the echo of every man who thinks he can rule the world, you'll hear it again. that old rhythm, that pulse, the heartbeat of fear. Maybe Attila's story was never really about him. Maybe it was about us. Because every time a new empire rises, every time someone thinks they've got the world figured out, history leans in and whispers, remember how this ends. The truth is, Attila didn't just shape his time, he shaped the way we dream about power, and the way it always, inevitably, slips away. The scourge is gone, but the silence he left behind, it's still with us. And in that silence, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear his name carried on the wind, Attila.